Hello, everybody. James here, Franchise University with Shane Douglas. There he is with the most famous six fingers in wrestling.
Yeah, all crooked and bent up, and it's
Now, as I usually say on these things, I can't remember if there are any plugs or anything, so we're just going to get cracking on straight into it. So, Clash of the Champions 22. I'll give you more information on the show itself, attendance and all that kind of thing when we get there. But as we sort of established with our last two episodes where we have gone back to pay-per-views or big shows past, I'm going to give you some of the news beforehand, and then we're going to sort of react to it. And when I say news, I mean the news that happened a couple of weeks before the Clash, and then we'll end on some news that happened afterwards as well. And the big news, aside from Starrcade wrapping up a couple of weeks earlier with Steamboat and Shane Douglas versus Brian Pillman and Barry Windham, and Sting versus Big Van Vader being particular highlights, the big news in the wrestling world occurred the month before this Clash, a few weeks earlier, when Nails, Kevin Wackles, was fired from the WWF. Was that an applause there, slightly breaking out?
yeah, a little golf clap. Yeah, it's, but there's a modicum of respect, I think, for most of the guys in the business to Kevin Kelly and Nails.
So a few weeks earlier at the Clash, he ended up throttling Vince McMahon over a pay dispute relating to SummerSlam 1992 that lasted, not the throttling, but the argument, 45 minutes to an hour. After the fight was eventually broken up by WWF agents Sergeant Slaughter, Earl Hebner, Arnold Skoland, and Gorilla Monsoon, Nails called police, claiming that McMahon had tried to molest him.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And,
brilliant cover.
Yeah, brilliant cover. I mean, he's so pretty as well, wasn't he? Kevin as well. And this was apparently the second. I never heard this until today. I'd researched it. This was apparently the second time Vince had made an unwanted advance on Mr. Nails, the last time happening a month earlier at Madison Square Garden. He then goes to do really nothing in wrestling. He's more or less, I won't say retired, but then he gives an impassioned I hate Vince McMahon's guts speech at McMahon's federal steroid trial that was very much counterproductive to, I'm sure, his intended goals. Now, Papa Shango replaces Nails in house show main events versus The Undertaker. Nails, how much interaction, if any, did you have with Kevin Wackles over the years?
Yeah, very little. He, as I recall, was a guy that sort of kept to himself, not in a jackass way or anything. He just like came in, did his thing, left. I don't, in my recollection, recall him like palling around with anybody. You sort of, when you're on the road, you sort of click up with your buddies and pals and things. And I don't recall ever seeing Kevin. It's not to say he didn't, but I don't ever recall seeing that. But he always seemed to be a pretty straight up dude to me. Obviously a tough guy. Just came in and just did his thing, and that was it. It was pretty always straightforward, at least around me, in my recollection.
Telegram, telephone, telewrestler. How long did it take for you to hear the news? And actually, what was your reaction? Because at the time, you'd come off, a very favourable sort of run with the WWF, and I imagine that you had sort of fairly positive opinions of Vince at the time. So what were your reactions to that news?
Yeah, surprised because, this is the kind of, having straddled both the real world and the wrestling world, right? Having been a teacher and, started some businesses and things, it's the kind of thing you can't, in any job you've ever had, have you ever thought like you're going to go there and somebody's going to beat the boss up, right? It just doesn't, not the kind of thing that typically happens. But in wrestling, at this time, we're sort of in this gray period between old school, new school, professional wrestling, sports entertainment. So the business is in this transition period. But in either of those schools, it still was never copacetic to say, okay, I'm going to beat the boss up. That's what told me when I first heard, you're taken back, huh, what? And then you start to think it through and go, okay, because there's always these scuttlebutt rumors. I'll state it like Bruno used to always state it, San Martino. I can't say I saw with my own eyes, but I would always hear these stories. And now that doesn't make them true or not. But when you base it on, how long being in the business and working there multiple times, the things that we had seen on planes and, different buildings and things like that. And then you start putting pieces together. And again, that doesn't necessarily guarantee that you're correct in the puzzle that you assemble. But the old saying goes, where there's smoke, there's fire. And there was certainly this same picture kept popping up, whether it was being told in the dressing rooms, on planes and cars, traveling in hotel rooms, hotel bars. You would hear this constantly over and over again. And then this happens with Kevin Kelly. You could tell that he was the type of guy that wasn't to be trifled with. Like he didn't seem like he suffered fools well. And, being a big tough guy like that, if the allegation being that he made advances on him, I'm sure Kevin would have shot that down, and so like to try it a second time, like, okay, it wasn't successful the first time, so let's try it again. It just seems odd, but I do know that from that point forward, Vince McMahon would never go into a room with a wrestler alone again. And the way I'd always taken this story, and again, this is like, it's not a thing that comes up quite often, but like when my take on the story since then had always been, there was a money dispute. I'm hip. I get that. Experienced it myself, and that there was this, confrontation over the money, and Kevin beat the hell out of him and made the allegation based like to protect himself, so that Vince couldn't go and say, hey, this guy beat me up or whatever. That was, as far as my recollection goes, to where the story, I had never given the credence or looked at it from the point of view of, did it really happen? So I can't speak on that side of it. I just know that afterwards, Vince was rare to go into, I shouldn't say never, like it's one of those generalizations, right? But he was very, very rare that he'd walk in. If you remember my story backstage the last show today, at the Garden, the doctor and I are in the room with him, and there's a, Blackjack Lanza, Rene Goulet, Arnold Skoland, all the Chief Chase Trumbo, they were all in there. Pat Patterson, there was a group of people in there. And that was always, my takeaway from it, that Vince going forward. But, you said something like, Kevin's comments at the steroid trial. And we had talked the last episode, a little bit about the allegations, pending allegations right now. And so-called impending indictment. This is and I said it then, if you recall, like on the federal steps after he won, Vince won. He came out and what did he say? I'm Vincent fucking McMahon. You don't doink the government in the eye like that, because if I'm the FBI agent in charge of that case, or the DOJ person, I might retire in 20, 30 years. And when I retire, you're the incoming guy. I'm going to give you that file and say, hey, keep your eye on this jackass. Mm-hmm. Right. And then when you retire, it's going to go on to the next one, the next one, the next one. You just don't poke the bear that way. And so that, it's possibly a little bit what we're seeing in the current situation with the looming indictment, alleged looming indictment. But with Kevin, like Kevin had always taken on like sort of a cult status in the business. For anybody that had experienced the WWF, WWE that I experienced, and I think he'll always hold that cult status because of that. A little bit of envy in the fact that he was able to do it and get away with it.
Yeah, I always loved the story that there were loads of wrestlers outside and none of them bothered to help. They were just sort of... Anyway, we will move on now. This is actually going to be a two-pronged thing. Bill Watts, shortly before the Clash, announces that if wrestlers miss time due to injury, they will be paid workman's compensation, but not their full guarantee. Which leads us to Rick Rude not making the Starrcade pay-per-view a couple of weeks earlier, and he would remain on the sidelines until March 1993 due to bulging discs in his neck. How much... this is probably going to be an unfair question, actually, now that I read it back very briefly, but how much of Rude's injuries do you think were a work, if any, to get the Lloyds of London compensation sort of squared away in that sense? Because he wrestled till somewhere in 94 and then he retired due to neck and back issues. But then a few years later, when you knew him really well in ECW, it seemed like he was desperate to get back in the ring.
Yeah. Well, my understanding at the time was that you had like, I want to say it was 2 years. Like if you made the claim on the Lloyds and all those Minneapolis boys, as I recall, if not all of them, a good chunk of them had gotten the payout. And at some point we go back to wrestling. I want to say, as my memory serves, it was like you couldn't wrestle for 2 years. Then after that, you were clear.
Well,
But
actually,
Lloyd's,
I'll jump in very briefly here. Apparently, if Rick Rude had been off more than 3 months, he would have got $20,000 a month, and then he would have also got the back pay for the 3 months that he was off as well. So that's for his specific deal, but also it gets a bit more convoluted when it's combined with his existing contract, who he signed with Kip Fry as well, which would have been a favourable contract for Rick at that point,
sure.
far more favourable than Bill would have written it, I'm sure.
Yeah, and look, contracts are as they're written. Like, you don't get to come in tomorrow and say, "Well, here's my interpretation on the contract." I mean, you can try that in court, but it's probably not going to stand. So again, and I can't speak on Rick's or Mike's or the Kurt's, the different people that had those Lloyds of London. I do know that Lloyds of London, right in that same time frame, wouldn't insure wrestlers anymore. So I do remember the bump that he took in Japan, where the floor was darkened and he took the bump thinking he was falling to the floor. And here the floor was beyond the stage, like another 12 or 14 inches lower. And I remember the bump, was pretty nasty on top of his head. Rick was such a great performer. Like, even with injury, you could be able to cover it up, I'm sure. But when he came to ECW, you could tell that he wasn't quite the Rick Rude that I had known in '90, or even '93 later in WCW. There's always the rumors in the Minneapolis guys worked the whole thing. I saw the bump that Rick took, and it would shock me if he wasn't injured. So that to me, that's one of those things. I'm not trying to be vague, but it's one of those things that had become such like an almost urban legend in the dressing room. These guys all got this insurance, and all took, sooner or later they all claimed on it, and the bill coming out and making the claim saying, well, from this point forward, you'll only be paid this way, not that way. That would all be contained in the contract. So my guess is the way that Kip was giving out the contracts, and I never worked for Kip. Marty and I were supposed to go as the new rockers before there was a woman found dead at his house after a party. But it sounded to me as though Kip Fry was just handing out like really sweet deals to everybody. And those guys were also, Rick especially. And I say that because my interactions with Rick and listening to him talking about like what supplement to take and what time of the day and what to take it with and when to stop it. It was almost like he was a pharmacist. And, but like I've often said that in those things, you'd have that, that sense of really real intelligence. And then that would turn right around. And like, if one was good, 10 was better. And I think most lay people know that's a fool's approach. But these guys, to me, it had become such like urban legend in the dressing room that the guys would openly talk about it in the dressing room. And this, there was a part of it that almost seemed like a worked aspect, like they're pulling our leg because it couldn't be that easy to go get a couple $1,000,000 from Lloyd's, and especially in professional wrestling. But my understanding was that a bunch of them didn't. If you go back and look at that time frame, there were times when a lot of these guys were off for extended portions of time, and then I know Lloyd's, like I said, right after that, like closed that door, no more, wasn't covering wrestling anymore. So, but again, like with Rick, specifically with Rick Rude, the bump that he took in Japan, I'm sure everybody could pull it up on YouTube and see. It was a hellacious bump, and it's hard to explain to fans, I guess, but like when in the old setup where they had the lights over the ring and the rest of the building was sort of darkened out, there's been plenty of times that I've been in the ring and you look down from the apron and it just looks like a bottomless pit. You really can't see a floor; it's just dark, and you could jump off and think you're landing here, and you're really landing here or here. And the bump that he took with that, I forget if it was a senton or, but the guy coming out and catch him, and Rick going back thinking he's going to hit this way, and he actually hits this way, on top of his head with that extra weight on top of it. So it was a really, for those of us that know bumps, it was a bump that's shocking that if he didn't snap his neck, because it was that kind of a bump, into that dark black.
I'm just looking here. Rick Rude would turn up. So his last match was on 9th of December 1992. Not last match, I mean before he got injured. And then he returned 8th of March 1993. Okay, so where are we going to go? Next bit is Davey Boy Smith and the WWF are in legal wrangling over Bulldog. Was recently let go of receiving shipments of stuff. We'll leave it there. Faxing Davey saying he couldn't use the British Bulldog name, despite the fact that he owned the trademark for it until October 1993. Davey was scheduled to debut at this very clash that we're going to be talking about today, but difficulties escaping his Titan contract saw his debut delayed a little bit. His WCW deal was said to be worth $100,000 for 100 dates, plus a separate deal for European shows where he would be the biggest draw. And one more thing to add on it, Dynamite Kid also returned to wrestling in England under around this time under the name British Bulldog #1, which I had no idea until I read this morning, in fact.
Yeah, I hadn't either till I heard that. Interesting.
We shall move on with there. We'll talk about Bulldog, I'm sure, many, many more times in future shows, so we'll move on.
Sure.
Dustin Rhodes won the US title last, defeating Steamboat just days beforehand when, unbeknown to Dustin, Barry Windham had snuck out and DDT'd Rick onto the floor, therefore allowing Dustin to win via countout. What an awesome way to put over your new champion, eh?
Yeah, right. It's Barry was, and this is how wrestling was at the time, right? Barry had this prodigious run as a babyface and was a fantastic babyface, and was starting to get to the point where I'm guessing, at the age where like some of those big bumps he would take as a babyface, you want to be more judicious with those. And for those, especially at this time, like we're wrestling, the heels tended to be the more ogre looking guys and things. And Barry was like one of those really special talents in the ring that I'm sure bookers and Barry himself and probably the fans were probably wondering, like, what would he be like as a heel? And, of course, he took it as well as he took to being a babyface. But this is that transition period. I know what Ricky and I had the match with him and Dustin, and then later would go on, won the titles from them and then go on to wrestle Brian and Steve. And then there's this thing, we'll talk about it a little bit later, but this match where, there's this inner mingling of all these different faces. And, and Dustin somehow just didn't fit into that mix to me. Like it was, Dustin was more the worker, and these guys, like he did with Steamboat, obviously, but it just, sometimes you look at a match, at least for me, I'll watch and look at something and something looks like, okay, these guys fit like a glove, right? I mean, this looks right. And then there's other times you look and say, okay, like this one doesn't quite fit in. Like it's just like an odd piece out there. And because Barry was transitioning in that heel babyface role and Dustin was like alongside, it seemed a bit awkward for Dustin, but he's such a pro that he's able to make it work. But I don't want to get too far ahead in discussing the because later in the show the main event of that show, that clash. But Dustin, when I go back and watching all of these, the first thing that jumps out to me is like how young we all were. Like, my God, you look at it and like we're all babies. And
how old were you? In fact, 1993.
27, 8, like in that range. So it was we were kids, and but like even like Arn and Orndorff and Vader and Steamboat and all. I mean, everybody looked young, and but like what my biggest takeaway is going back, because I don't routinely watch these matches. I haven't seen these matches probably in 25 plus years. But what strikes me is how hard everybody's working, and how good the talent were. You watch, like, now I'll point some things out when we get to our match with Brian and Steve. Those little things that I'm looking for as a performer, and you watch Steve, and I've always said it about Steve, his positioning is impeccable. But there's none better in the business. And you watch him and just see how fluidly he's doing these things. Steamboat, in much a different way, much more the master, just mechanically to the A to B to C and just making it look incredible. But Steve's looks more like choppy by design, a little more haphazard, but he's really doing the same thing Steamboat's doing in a different degree. And you watch, like, again, when I'm watching these matches, the entire show, I was looking at watching Johnny B. Bad in the second match, and I said, what a shame, because he was like 5 years too early. Like a few years later, man, that kind of character was going to be huge. But he was one of the first to come out and do that kind of a character. And you watch it in context now, having the backdrop of what the business would do beyond that. And then, boy, he was just a little bit too early. Had he crested at the right time, well, who knows where he would have gone. But man, all babies in those things. It's crazy.
Well, definitely Mark Merrow will be brought up quite soon. Also, I've got something else for Dustin Rose, but I'm going to leave that for a little later. You'll understand why when I bring it up. Next bit of news is that, and I don't know exactly what date this is, but Medusa leaves WCW either right at the end of 1992 or early 93, but I think it's the end of 1992. Do you know why? Because I don't.
I don't. Those are the types of things that happened. If you look back over your career and you're thinking like, okay, these really great talents are there, and then poof, they're gone. They just disappear. It happened so often that like it was sort of just like the milk carton week. Like, who's on the milk carton this week? Like, who's not here anymore? But you're so nose to the grindstone. You have your own stuff to pay attention to, and tending to your stuff. That for me anyway, there wasn't time to go into the soap opera of everybody else's stuff. You'd hear scuttlebutt, you'd hear little rumors and stuff like that. But Ducey was like, in fact, through her career, like where those few places our careers would intercede each other, like cross over. That seems to be the takeaway. She's there, and then she's not, and then she's there, and then she's not. But I think a lot of that, like, my take on it now and looking back, is that Medusa was ever a professional, and when things would get to she was one of those people that had that foresight that, okay, well, this is heading in the wrong direction, no reason to play it out and get out of here. That was the way I always took it. I don't know if that's the way it was, but I've always seen her like one of the professional pros in our business.
One of the possibly the reason was supposedly that she wanted to wrestle in WCW, wasn't really interested in a women's division. But you know what? Looking back at many years ago, WWF in the mid-90s and WCW when she jumped over there, is that, man, do you know what? Especially for it might seem weird me saying it, but a Western woman in the 90s, man, she could go like the Japanese girls back in the day. She really, really was really good. And WCW especially just would not let her wrestle at all if they could help it.
And I think in WCW there was always this, even though we were outwardly saying we're the wrestling company, and and that was what it looked like, there was always this nipping around the periphery of trying to mimic in some ways the sports entertainment stuff. And I always thought it was just an absolute mistake. As a business person, whether it's selling hot dogs on the street corner, professional wrestling, the last thing you want to do is be Johnny come lately to the hot thing. You want to be the guy that's creating the next hot thing. And as with the last episode we did on the one pay-per-view, and now today the Clash, when I'm watching that, I'm thinking to myself, these are good matches. The talent's really good in the ring, and it's. To me, WCW made its fatal mistake, and who knows if it would have been sold or not after that. But to me, where WCW really started carving out its own headstone was when it started trying to mimic the sports entertainment stuff. That was never seen as that kind of a company, and we were never going to out Vince at being Vince. Let him be that. Let's be this over here. And even if there's a little bit less, rating or money than them over there, I would dare say Ours Product was a lot cheaper company to run at that time, comparative. So it's the same thing with ECW. When we made the conscious decision to go after that 18 to 49 male demographic, that was by design. There was an underserved demographic that was being pushed out the door because they didn't want the cartoons, and WCW started trending that way. So along came this company that was going to cater specifically to them. Now that doesn't mean it's going to preclude women from watching or younger kids from watching or whatever, but by design that was the demographic we went for. And I be a bit braggadocious, say we probably owned that demographic for the majority of the time that we were running. Ultimately you can say, okay, well, we need to add hot dogs because we're selling hamburgers. But once you start to water that down and start to go in that direction, the fans, the fans who want the hamburgers are going to leave and go someplace else. And I think that's what happened both for ECW and WCW. And I think the takeaway is, there's Coca-Cola, there's Pepsi, and there's 7-Up and Sprite. You could have your choice of the four. But if you're going to go out and try to be like Coca-Cola, Coca-Cola's probably got that covered. Find the demographic that you can own. Their money's as green as everybody else's. There may be less of them, but you're not going to steal away many of the other companies' kids, like in WWF's case, the tweeners, and in WCW's case, the older people that have grown up watching the NWA and all of that. Those are, it's like trying to get people to switch cigarette brands, right? They're going to stick with what they are. And the same thing with wrestling. Wrestling fans, the same thing. And when you digress from that, when you move away from what it is you intended originally for your promotion to be, that's when I think you start losing fans.
I'm going to give you a few more bits of news. We won't dwell on these. Ultimate Warrior also fired the same day as the British Bulldog for the same reason, makes his first post-WWF appearances of the Warrior, wrestling Hercules in front of 500 people in Billerica, Massachusetts. Ray Rougeau is hired as French language announcer, as well as partially replacing Mean Gene doing some interviews in the WWF. And this is the weirdest one that I found. Angelo Poffo attempts to open a promotion in England called World Alliance Wrestling. I have no idea about that one.
Yeah, it's a left fielder. I think we had talked in the last episode about, Ric Flair and penchant to keep going back to the well. And I'm guessing with Angelo, he had run a fairly successful promotion. When you see wrestling as hard as it was at that time, you could see where investors would say, hey, maybe there's another product that we can offer over here. And, you go and look at Angelo's background and having run a successful promotion, you could see how some investors might say, hey, this is the guy to go with. It's, potentially. History tells us that sometimes isn't necessarily the case. Bruno trying to start, what was it called in Pittsburgh? International Wrestling or something like that. And it was like 2 or 3 shows and done. When the time marches on, you got to keep up with those times. You can incorporate some of those things. But I always say, we're not taking wrestling back to 85. We're going to take the best of 85 and bring it up to this. And, create an amalgamation between those styles. The tried and true typically always works, but it doesn't work when you just say, okay, we're going to go back to doing it just like that and have none of this current stuff. And, we're going to basically turn back the hands of time. Can't do that. Time always marches forward. I
know, just anyone trying to start a new wrestling promotion in 1993. And if wrestling was on life support in America in 93, then it was dead in England. That's why all the WWF guys and WCW went to Europe, because, they were climbing for American wrestling. Anyway, Clash of the Champions 22. Oh, yeah. It opens with the disappointing news that Heavy Metal Van Hammer is out of the main event that evening due to an injury. The only story I ever hear about Heavy Metal Van Hammer is when William Regal headbutted him at Diamond Dallas Page's party. Have you got? I mean, you can tell the same story. I love that story, but have you got any other stories or similar stories about Van Hammer?
No, it was I always got along great with him. It seemed like an easy going enough guy. I think I mentioned this in another episode. When you're watching people, in the dressing room, you're watching the monitor or at the curtain and watching. It's much like music to me. I'll hear them come out and say, "Hey, here's the Rolling Stones' new hit song." It's go, yeah, it's not very good. Like my ear, and I'm pretty solid on that. I can tell you, like if they say something's gonna be a hit, I can tell you if I believe it's gonna be or not, and I'm usually right on it. I just have that earwig. And same thing with wrestling. You watch it and go, okay, like I'm watching this, and I'm being told this, but I don't see it. And please understand, this is not me gauging myself against anybody else. It's just me looking at a talent going up or down, and I never saw him as like a guy that there was another match later with Johnny and Joe's brother, Mark, and Al Green. Same thing when you watch that and you see like even on the cover, it's just this sort of like flop down on the guy and roll around and cover. It just looks sloppy. It's just not neat. And and you watch it, you go, okay, probably not going to make it. And Van Hammer always seemed like those guys, big guy, great body, could play a guitar, all those types of things they were trying to imbue into that character. But again, ultimately, it's about the in-ring performance once you get inside those ropes. And when you see those bigger guys like that, that want to go out and try to show, hey, I can do like this move that Ray does, or that Benoit does, or whatever. Okay, great, you can do the move. Should you do the move? That's the real question. And at that point, you're just mimicking and sort of like attempting to be something that you shouldn't attempt to be. You have to understand what your character is, right? And like my character would never go in there and say have a match with Hulk Hogan where I'm going to bear hug him, right? He's twice my size. It would look silly. So the things that your character should do or would do and should or wouldn't do. And I think that for Van Hammer, that was like one of the things. It was the jumping shoulder butts and like trying to do the more aerial stuff instead of being that big bruiser guy that could have gotten in there and done that. But he had a great look. And at that time, when they're trying to create new characters and they see, rock music's big. They had the rock and wrestling connection not long before. On paper, that you can see where their mindset was. But again, ultimately, it's just about like when you're looking inside the ring, and every wrestling show needs to have a curtain jerk and have a popcorn match just by proxy of where it is on the card. And I don't think it's happenstance when you go back and look at the people that became semi-main eventers and main eventers. It's certainly not a universal rule, but it's rare that you see somebody get into like one of those upper positions and go, "Ooh, he's terrible." Right? You can see where they've tried to do that in the past, and typically those characters don't work long term. But for the most part, you can tell that when somebody with intelligence is booking, because usually the people that ascend into those semi-mains and main events usually can carry the ball there. There's a whole lot of times, and it's just like in baseball, everybody's trying to hit a home run, right? Doesn't mean every player that steps up to the plate is going to hit that home run. And ultimately wrestling does need new characters. So there's always going to be a try and fail, a try and a fail and a try. Who knows if it's 5-1, 3-1, 1-1. You try every time. Every wrestler you're hiring, you're intending that wrestler to be a star. Through trial and error, it finally becomes apparent it's not going to be, and they sort of either dwindle off or get jobbed off or whatever. But the announcement from Bill that it seemed the old place to me. Again, like I always talk about history being through the contemporary lens. So we're looking at it 23, looking back on 93, and trying to assess based on today. But at that time, the company put a lot of time, had been putting a lot of time into Hammer, and you could see in that context why the boss would be coming out and talking about this and why he's not going to be at that show and stuff. But it also had, because if you remember, that sort of segued into also a discussion about his son, and we have an investigation.
We're going to get there, Shane. Trust me, we're going to get there. That's going to be fun. Just before we get off Van Hammer, I'd like to. It's like Chekhov's gun. If you give someone a prop, and you will know this from your time in WCW the first time around with Johnny, eventually you're going to have to use it. Or you sort of end up sort of exposing yourself in the sense that you're playing the part. Van Hammer couldn't really play guitar.
What are you talking about? I have no idea what you're talking about.
Listen, dude. So it's sort of like the skateboard thing, though, isn't it? I mean, they give you a skateboard. Yeah. I don't think I ever saw you use the skateboard. I think I might have seen Johnny ride down the ramp once, maybe, or twice. But yeah, it's one of those things where if you give someone a prop, then at some point, to be a character of substance, it needs to be part of you. You need to actually know how to use it.
Correct. Yeah. Hey, for everybody out there, I love the reference to Chekhov's gun. Google Chekhov's gun, and you'll see what we're talking about. It's brilliant, allusion to point to. But yeah, like for me, I didn't know how to ride a skateboard. I never rode a skateboard. Even when I would try it, the problem was at TV. Pay-per-views and television tapings, there were always big TV cables, camera cables, lighting cables going across. You'd have to be damn. What's the Tony? The big skateboarder guy. He's
Hawk.
Yes, Tony Hawk, right? My son was, he went through a period when he went through that. Yeah, you're going to be exposed sooner or later. And I guess you're alluding to a Van Hammer with a guitar
Mm.
and, having that, it's there. What is it? Is he going to play a show before each match, a song or something? It just is ill placed. It just looks like, okay, I'm going to walk to the ring with, a bottle of seltzer water for no reason. It's just, okay, I'll put it down there. If I'm not advertising it or whatever, why did I take it with me? I think at this time WCW had a whole lot of that kind of stuff going on.
Now, as you said before, Bill Watts, we will get to Eric, I promise you. In fact, let me go through the sort of bump of the show first. January 13th, 1993, 2.9 rating with a 4.2 share, making it the second least watched Clash in history, barely topping Clash 19, which garnered a 2.8. The attendance was 4,000, somewhat papered, I believe, in attendance. Tony Schiavone and Bill Watts welcome us to the Mecca in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I just said there before, somewhat papered, 4,000. And as we know, as I alluded to it before, and you were right there, every day going up and down the house shows, it was a bad time for wrestling everywhere, from WWF, WCW, and indies were almost non-existent. There was Smoky Mountain, USWA, couples like that, barely struggling. Yep. How sort of bad was WCW attendance on house shows in 1993 at the time?
Yeah, really bad. I understand for the fans out there watching this, we were paid directly off the houses. So you go into a house and you're a opener or mid-card match and you see 30% full. That's a shit payoff. I mean, it's just going to be. And so, you start to get into this like malaise feel where, you're going to work, you're not working any less hard than you would before, but maybe you're not taking as many bumps and maybe, you're being a little more judicious in the ring, not taking as many chances, which is really the inverse universe of what you should be doing, right? If the building's a third full and you want to be half full next time, really work your ass off. But when you're doing this night after night, it's like how many people go to work and can say, okay, last night I remember every minute of my 8-hour shift. It's the same thing in wrestling. It's a job to us, and as special as it is to go to the ring each night, when you see that the building empty, and you hear it before the show starts, and people please move to the other side of the arena, because they're gonna fill up, and you're going, oh man, like it's gonna be a crap week on your paycheck. So it did have a definite effect, even though you were trying not to, and being urged not to. It just common sense, it does. And so at this time the houses were down, and I think this is part of the reason you see Bill taking chances, right? Like with a Van Hammer, and he's going, there were a lot of these new, like there was that temporary time where you weren't allowed to do anything off the top rope. And once wrestling had gone there, you can't pull it back. You can't put that toothpaste back in the tube. And if you do, then the crowd's going like, oh man, and they're getting a reason to look out, because the other place is still doing the stuff off the top rope. I give Bill credit for trying to think of other things to do like that to try to put some legitimacy back into it and everything. But the 90s, as you're saying, it was across the board. But this is wrestling. If you look back from the start of professional wrestling in the earliest days, we would see these huge peaks and then these deep valleys and these huge peaks and these deep, it just would transcend that way. And I think it's just in anything, the natural course of it. When you're hitting these peaks, nobody's trying to think of anything creative because business is great. But when it starts on that downslide, you're on that roller coaster. It's going to the bottom of the hill anyway. It doesn't matter. You scream, you don't scream, you put your hands up, you don't put your hands up. That thing's going where it's going. But at least during this time, they're trying some stuff. And through the course of hit or miss, success and failure, you start to hit on some things, and then you bottom out, and then you start to ride the next peak. Very, very typical. I mean, that's exactly what anybody would do in any business. Try to find that next trend. Sometimes you're successful, sometimes you're not. And WCW in this time, even prior to I think Eric Bischoff gets from the fans that are hardcore fans for WCW or NWA. He takes the brunt of, well, okay, this is when they started transitioning towards sports entertainment. In reality, that had started happening years before. That's why you have a Van Hammer with a guitar and all these different attempts. Turn him heel, turn him back, baby. Bring this one in, bring him out. There was a lot of moving pieces in there at this time, and that really preceded Eric's time in WCW. Eric would take it to a whole different place, but that was already going on prior to that, and you can see in this pay-per-view as a microcosm, I think a whole big chunk, like I said, about Johnny B. Bad, Mark Marrow. Boy, you watch him come out and the charisma and the poise and everything else. But we know that because of today, looking back, we've watched how many people do that on, these huge shows in WWFE, and later other companies. Just a smidge too early in my estimation, but boy, he oozed that. And on this show, you can see a lot of these ups and downs, and we'll talk about those more as we go on to each of the matches. But that was my takeaway from it. Like, okay, you could tell that the company's the roller coaster is rolling downhill here, and Bill, in this case, is attempting to throw some to see whatever sticks. And some of it did, and some of it didn't. Creation of Hollywood Blondes had a hell of a tag team in me and Ricky. I think Barry turning heel, would turn to be a bright spot for WCW in the future, a little bit down the road from that. So yeah, but completely typical of what I expected in any promotion that's in that downhill slot at that point.
I had a look up. It was December 1992. The attendance average for WCW house shows was 930.
Ooh, yeah, that sounds about right.
Yeah. I don't know what the worst month is, but I mean that can't be too far from it. And this might actually be a bigger question than I sort of anticipate really, but what do you think hastened the decline in popularity in wrestling in the early 90s, according to you? Because I can give a couple of examples. WWF-wise as the market leader, Hulk Hogan is on the outs pretty much. I mean, he retired, quote-unquote, 1992 WrestleMania. So this is some 8 months. There's also various federal investigations and other accusations as well. Of the 2-3 things I've mentioned there, how much credence or percentage of blame, essentially, for the decline of wrestling do you give them all?
Well, they're certainly all complicit, right? But there are others. We're now, by this time, starting to see this wave of deaths that are, starting to hit in wrestling. And for the fans sitting at home, I can talk about my boys. When they were younger and watching wrestling, their eyes would be this big. And boy, they're in front of the TV and they loved it. And as they're getting older, they're starting to hear like, wait, my favorite guy died? Well, how'd he die? And, there was always a sort of like dour side that was coming beyond these things. That because of the dirt sheets and just social media, on its beginning of its rise, where suddenly we're hearing stories that would have never been heard before. Those would have always been kept kayfabe behind curtain, but they're leaking out. And I remember like when the David Von Erich story came out. This is like right at the time I'm beginning to break into wrestling. And, I would later hear the full story, but you're like, okay, the guy was like 24 and died in. How do you die at 24? And just like one of those trainers, okay, well, maybe he had a congenital issue or something. You don't know, but it's there. It's in the back of your head, and you hear that, and then more, and then there's more, and then there's more. And at the same time, I think there was this push by Vince to expose the business to save the on the commission taxes, because as a show, you don't have to pay the commission tax. I'd heard the number, don't know how accurate it is, that it was for like $1,200 to $1,500 per show. So you're going to, expose how you cut the lady in half to do this in a business that had always been guarded. Now we could argue, would later come, but at this time, we don't know that wrestling is going to get to the stratospheric heights it would get in a few years later. So these are all part of it, and you could point the finger to a lot of us coming in that WCW was pushing, like me included, with Ricky Steamboat. It was really Ricky Steamboat and this kid Shane Douglas with him. We were disparate parts at that point. Brian and Steve, as phenomenal as they were as a team, they were really both untested. Brian was great on the stick, and Steve's positioning in the ring was second to none. But he hadn't yet become Stone Cold Steve Austin, right? So there's this, again, like I always talk about looking through the contemporary lens. If you snap yourself back into this time frame and look just through that lens, and you have no idea the stuff beyond that, you can see where the fans are going, okay, well, like there's less of the guys I love, like Flair and, all these stars that have been the NWA. And now we're seeing this guy, Brian Pillman, and this guy, Steve Austin, and this guy, Shane Douglas, and this guy, Tom Zank, and Tom Brandy, all these young bucks coming in. Now, later we would all prove ourselves in the business, but at that time we were untested commodities. At the same time, Flair was getting older, Hogan was getting older. And so you've got this convergence of all these things, this move to sports entertainment that was heresy to wrestling fans. But it's being successful. It's pulling younger kids in over here and jettisoning some fans over here. So is the turnover good enough to warrant losing those fans that are going to be around forever? These are all the big question marks. We're in the infancy still, even though WrestleMania had started some years prior, but we're still like in the beginning stages of pay-per-view and how what's too much and what's too little. All these things are going on concurrently, and so there's no way to say, okay, stop, let's just focus on new characters, or let's just focus on pay-per-views, but these things are all going and swirling in the blender at the same time. And so you got to try to figure it out as you're moving along. And I think all of them had some deleterious effect on the business, but also then you could argue set the stage for that next big rise in the business. So again, that peak and valley, this young punk kid, Shane Douglas, with Ricky Steamboat. Okay, I'm a little familiar with him. Who is he? He hasn't really proven himself. I've not seen him like I've seen Steamboat in classic after classic after classic after classic. And, Harley Race, another amazing talent now as a manager. And so it's this sort of transition period in wrestling that we could argue did or didn't contribute to the stratosphere we go into a few years later. But these things are all swirling at the same time. Like you said, the pending retirements and unretirements and, iconic names in, iconic names out, new faces in. There's so much going on at this time that I think I'd be shocked if you look back and say, man, the houses were blowing through the roof, but it would in a few years. And I don't think you can just dispel that all of that was going on right then would settle itself out. It's like when you shake, you put a big pile of dirt in a sifter and you sift through and you get down smaller and smaller, and finally you find the relics. I think the same thing with wrestling. If wrestling was at a sifter at this point, we're digging through it and finding out who will be those next stars that are going to launch new promotions and whatever. But at this time, we're still the untested kids that hadn't proven anything.
Now, as we sort of alluded to slightly before, and you were just saying about how Bill Watts was welcoming us with Tony Schiavone, and then he launches into why his son, Eric Watts, has been suspended. That reason didn't... Okay, right, I know what the reason is because I had to look it up, but the fact is that the reason wasn't actually explained whatsoever on the Clash show. Do you remember what the reason was? I mean, storyline-wise, but do you remember what the reason was?
Yeah, that there was some... that Eric was accused of something, I forget, but I remember at the time thinking, like, this is silly. Like, this is not like, it doesn't feel like wrestling. But as I watched it back last night, if you stop it and just look at it just as is, it sounds almost identical to what would happen today, right? I accuse my boss of sexual harassment in the workplace, and there's going to be stop. There's going to be, you go home, you're paid leave. We're going to do an investigation. And, so it seemed almost like way before its time as I'm watching this. I want to say a note about Eric. Great guy. Had been a football player, big college football player. Had been brought in, and I don't think in the most optimal of circumstances. There was a way to do that prior. Maybe that might have been the way prior, but the fact that he had not been in wrestling at all, and the boss's kid pops up, just reeked of nepotism, and that was unfair to Eric. It really was. I mean, God almighty, this business is hard enough. We've talked about this ad nauseum to learn without that kind of added pressure to it. I thought he gave a decent promo. It looked at times to me like he was trying to remember checklists, things he was supposed to say. But again, that's exactly what I would expect for a kid. And at this time, he's a kid in our business. The football aside, he's brand new to wrestling, and every wrestling fan knew, obviously who his dad was, and it's almost like when David Flair. It is like when David Flair came in. Man, he was screwed from the start because he's a second generation of perhaps the greatest wrestler in the history of our business. And I don't care how good you are, you're going to pale in comparison. And the same thing here. But that what the fans were seeing on camera was part of it. There was also another part behind the scenes that was vicious at times. I saw him, Bill, that is, walk up to Eric and completely unassumingly walks up and you point out to Chris, I said, look at Bill's fingers in that thing. He said they're the sausage hands, and he comes up and he just upper hook right into the short rib. Oh, knocks. And when Eric goes to bend over, he yelled, I didn't tell you to stand the hell up. And he stands and he punches him again and does like 2 or 3 times so he can't get up. Because that's how you sell a punch. Because he'd worked with Kabuki that night and didn't sell on the ropes that well. I'm thinking, ooh, man, like, this is long before me being a father, but now I can't see myself in any way doing that with my kids. I'm not judging Bill here. Again, different times, different places, but that was that wasn't a tough spot. That was an impossible spot for Eric, unless he was going to come in and be Flair times 3, and learning on this job is not a very forgiving thing. I always thought it would have been much better suited to bring him in as an underneath guy under a hood, let him get some experience in the ring, then expose him later if you want to, and try that route. But you'd asked a second ago, and I gave that long-winded answer about like things that were going wrong in the business. That was one of the types of things that was going wrong in the business. The business as it was waning in this valley period. The last thing we needed was, here's a gratuitous, here's my kid, love him, throw him on the stage, and now you haven't beaten Arn, and you haven't beaten, big names and stuff. And that's sacrilege to wrestling fans. Wrestling fans will take to you, but it's going to take time. You got to earn their respect. And when you finally earn their respect, they'll slowly transition to that. But they ain't going to, here's my kid today, first day in wrestling. He's going to beat the biggest name in the business, or one of them. And, it was unfair to Eric. But again, I think Bill was just trying something, just trying to shake it up and trying to find something that would stick to the wall.
I've interviewed Eric as well. I've spoken to him a few times, and really personable guy. And he's full of charisma as well. And yes, the thing is, he would have had, if given seasoning, something proper to offer the business, because he had the right height. He had the lineage. Obviously, Bill Watts is his dad and everything. Sure. I'll get to a couple of different things. I'll probably ask you some other stuff as well relating to Eric. The reason why Eric was quote unquote suspended was because Arn Anderson, this is a pre-tape, Arn Anderson attacked him at a petrol station, gas station, which is what you would call it. Yep. And then Arn attacks him, and then Eric puts the dreaded shoots fight hold, the STF, on Arn Anderson in front of a fan cam, and that's why he ended up being taken off the show for storyline reasons. Now, this really didn't help for a couple of reasons. One, Eric stuttered his way through that interview. You could hear people booing in the background. And then when it goes back to Bill, and keep in mind, this is 1993, you do not hear this very often. It's not like the John Cena days or the Roman Reigns days with mixed crowd reactions. You can hear fans screaming, Eric Watts sucks, while his dad was giving a thing to the camera, a thing, you know what I'm saying? Yeah. It also doesn't help that Arn Anderson is one of the most respected wrestlers, even back then, and one of the best wrestlers in WCW. And it also suddenly didn't help that Arn Anderson had given an interview maybe a week or two earlier that aired on TV that was great. And it was so intense that he just ended up engendering more fan love through it as well. I also wrote this down. Eric Watts is backstage and he says there are accusations. So he sort of blows acquisitions and accusations there on that one. Yeah. Anything else that I want to bring up with Eric, or tell you, in fact, or ask you, I'm sorry, I'm not telling you, is how nuclear... Well, Eric Watts had a few weeks training before he was put on the road. How nuclear was the heat with Eric Watts, especially when he turned up in a Porsche?
Well, not so much with the boys. I mean, nobody was blaming him for being there. And like you said, he's very personable, easy to get along with. Nice guy. It wasn't that, but it was, sort of like you'd hear some later with with Bill Goldberg, with people that have been around the business. They're like, hey, this ain't fair. Like I've been here all this time, and there's a sort of a perceived pecking order. But when you're saying that, you were just mentioning it, and they're doing the interview, which was, I'm sure, pre-taped, and you hear the crowd chanting this stuff. rest assured, Eric, no matter where he is in the building while this is airing, he's hearing this. And when you're a young kid in this business, uh, you're a baby face. You go out there and you show fire and you hear crickets, right? It's like, it's a slog. And so, being so new to the business and being so young in it, I can't even imagine being thrown into that flame, weeks into training, with just a few weeks under your belt. No, again, he's very smart guy. So, he knows the nepotistic side of the way this looks. And then you start hearing that, and then that creates self-doubt. And then that itself becomes a vicious cycle. It was just a really, really, I think, wrong thing to do, and sad, because I'm sure, given time to grow into the business like any of us, he's a good athlete, he would have found it, and especially with that dressing room to teach. But it was overtly, it looked like what it was. Here's the boss going to try to, with all this talk about, if you get into a fight and you get beat, don't come back, you're going to get fired. Legitimacy. Boom, here's my kid. It was just incongruous, and it was a disservice to Eric. It was a disservice to the fans, and I can't say what went into Bill's thinking. I'm sure part of it, love for kid, and try to help him out. It's really ill-advised. I don't see how you could delude yourself and think that would work. And there's no harm, no foul. Every single one of us in that dressing room came up that way, and setting the ring up and earning your way in, and being manhandled in that ring and stuff, and learning. So that all of these things, like I said a second ago, they're all happening concurrently. They're all happening at the same time. And so you can see where the fan base would be dwindling away. They're really, if I was to say to you, give me a word or a sentence paraphrasing that Clash of Champions, what would you say? I mean, it's rise of the young guys, slewing off of
transitional. Felt like a transitional show. You've got some of the old, a lot of the new. Ric Flair's not returned yet. So, yeah, it's very much just sort of like in that netherworld in between the old and new.
And understand with Rick, I mean, Rick was a huge portion of that equation. He was the NWA, the WCW, right? So without him there, there's a gaping hole in this episode. And everybody says they want to book. We talked about Tony Khan and booking ain't an easy thing. It ain't just simple to sit down and, okay, Jam with wrestle Shane tonight, and then we'll do this and do that, and it's all going to draw money. I mean, you got to really think this stuff through, and then figure out how it's going to play in real world. Like, is this believable? Like the dumping of concrete into somebody's car. Okay, look, 911. Yeah, some jackass just dumped a bunch of concrete in my car. Yeah, he's driving a cement truck. I'm getting a new car, going to probably see you and win some money. You got to play that stuff through. And realistically, how is this going to be perceived by the audience that you're giving it to? And I think your word transitional is pretty good. Pretty accurate to what that show was. Yeah, there were bright spots. I don't see anybody being lazy in the ring. It wasn't, somebody's half-assing it out there. But, when you got an audience that loves Flair or loves to hate Flair, either or, and Arn and all these iconic talents, and all of a sudden here's a whole lot of these new guys, and then like the segment where they had Harley and Paul and Vader attack Barb, it was just like so up and down, in and out. What is it like? Where are we going with it? It just seemed like just stuff being thrown on camera that really had no rhyme or reason or direction to it, to me anyway.
There's one more thing about Eric Watts. So Bill Watts went on the 1-900 WCW hotline and this is around the time of this show, I can't remember if it's before or after, to rip into Mark Madden over a parody he did of Bill and Eric and Dusty and Dustin Rhodes, revolving around a fictitious TBS broadcast skit that saw Dusty and Bill receive one last attempt to push their sons. And it culminated in Eric Watts being crucified, but making a comeback with, quote, Eric Watts arising on the third day to an arena near you.
Yeah, I'm afraid later in ECW we'd have a similar with a upside down crucifix, right? It's wrestling is always parodying. We're playing off larger. If you go back and look at some of the extremely, by today's standards, racial stuff that we would see in wrestling, through the 50s and 60s, what it was doing was parodying society. And I think a lot of that goes into it. But when you start stepping onto stuff, we had an off-camera discussion about religion. When you start dealing, especially today, with people's political beliefs or people's religious beliefs or people's whatever core beliefs that they hold dear to them, you're almost always going to step on the mine. You're going to piss somebody off out there. And, pissing off can, some like heels piss fans off. That's the hope to bring them back, to bring some more people the next time. That's different than parodying religion or parodying somebody's political beliefs, or what they always talk about in real politics as the third rail. Don't touch it because you're going to get electrocuted. And when I was watching the 900 commercial, it brought back memories. It seemed it was so ubiquitous back then. But on the thing it said, phone number no longer works, or phone number no longer in service, something like that. So people wouldn't be trying to see if Bill Watts is still on the 900 line. It was, but again, like if you're bringing people in like Mark, you know what Mark is, right? Mark's a contrarian. I've listened to him in Pittsburgh for decades now. If the Steelers have a good game today, he's going to go on the air tonight and say they sucked, because it stimulates conversation. Oh, I'll call that son of a bitch and tell him they didn't suck. They won today, right? He's playing a heel. And when you give somebody carte blanche and you're not going to be overseeing or telling them, hey, we want to do skits like this or that, don't be upset if somebody does something that offends you. I would say for Mark, he probably should have better taste and thought in that. But, you can see like in WCW and all these things we're talking about, there's all these loose strings blowing around that nobody seems to be in control of them. They're wondering why, the audience is dipping down and going where it's going. I mean, it's I'd be shocked if you at the end said complete sellout, turn away crowd. I mean, really? Well, that's impressive for that garbage. But I shouldn't say garbage for that show. It just looks like the chaos that we've all come to analogize with WCW, right? I mean, this became the how not to do it company.
I should point out that I think this was Mark Madden when was he on PW Torch or something? I think he wasn't actually in WCW. This was a third party or dirt sheet or on the radio or something like that. This was before Mark sort of got involved in because he was involved in the 1-900 hotline at one point, I think, in the future. But we're finally going to get to, in fact, we're not even going to get to the first match yet. We've talked an hour and we've not got to the first match yet because there's just so much interesting stuff. Now we are welcomed by the commentators of the show, Jesse Ventura and Jim Ross on commentary. I probably asked you this before, but where does Jesse rank? Let's have a Mount Rushmore from you. I know everyone loves a list. A definitive list of the greatest colour commentators of all time. Where does Jesse fall on that?
In my book, number 2. He's right behind Bobby. He and Bobby both very different styles. Bobby Heenan, of course. Bobby could have been a stand-up comedian. I mean, he was just a funny guy. Jesse, different, but Jesse was quick-witted. I as a commentator, I didn't have that. I can't remember a joke to save my life. And I'm not as quick-witted as Jesse is to come off of that, boom, that quick little adage you're going to throw in there right now that perfectly suits to what's on screen. Mine was more to approach it from a point of view of, as an analyst, as a world champion, what am I seeing here? Explaining why this is a good approach or a bad approach. More analytical. Those guys had something that I was always envious of, because when you're on camera, especially live television, ain't no retakes, right? As Sid would later find out. So you got to be quick enough to be in front of that camera. And what stuck out of me with this show is when Bill comes on at the beginning, very matter-of-factly, very informatively, laying out information, remembered a whole lot of names and different angles, and that ain't easy. Like when you're doing the spot specifics. Okay, we're going to do a promo for Charleston, West Virginia, and you're going to wrestle Taz, and it's going to be on Saturday, November 13th, and it's going to be this and that. can watch on Channel 7. You got to remember all that and then do the promo and then go to the next one. And that's sort of all, you're there all day doing that. It starts to bleed into each other. So Bill coming out and having this whole company in his head and all these other things going on, plus the business side, and then going on camera and remembering these things and hitting them and laying them out there and saying them. Tony Schiavone, the same thing. Again, there's no point where you can say, I screwed it up. Let's start over. But these guys have done this, right? I see, like, you look at Jesse, just one step down for Bobby Heenan, because Bobby could be that humorous while you wanted to strangle him. Like, you laugh while you wanted to choke him. Jesse, you just wanted to choke, right? If you were a babyface fan. But really quick-witted. And you listen to, like, the things he's saying through the show, these little things that he's throwing in there. Some are well-placed, some are ill-timed, but it's quick-witted. He's coming up with that stuff. There's no script in front of him. Then you have Jim Ross, of course, quintessential play-by-play guy. And then Tony doing the segments in between. It really looked like a well-oiled commentary team. And, so I would say on that Mount Rushmore, as color commentators go, those two would be 1 and 2. And then, behind that, I would say Jerry Lawler for sure. Jerry's so fun to a substrate of the Bobby Heenan school. I don't think he's quite as funny as Bobby, but he's quick-witted, and can throw those things in, and makes it go really. And even though he was more like a play-by-play guy, I always saw Gene Okerlund as sort of that guy that straddled between the two, because he would give the matter of fact point of view, the straight man shtick. But then he'd also, at the end of it, like, throw some little comment in, that you'd listen to and just sort of chuckle at. As far as announcers go, to me, Joey Styles, and it's taking nothing away from anything, I think Joey Styles was the best because he didn't have somebody to play off of in all those times. Those are, even though we were doing VOs in ECW, understand what a VO is. You're doing live to tape. So if you screw it up, you're going to go back and do it again from the beginning and do it again and do it again. And Joey, I don't ever recall Joey having to never go back and do it again. So yeah, but there's so there's a lot of great announcers in wrestling, and the best of them, I think, can imbue those characters. What I disliked also personally from a color commentator's point of view is, in this case, Jesse and Bobby were both heels, so they're obviously just proponing the heel's point of view. A real expert on something could begrudgingly say something positive about a babyface, or vice versa. It doesn't mean you have to say that they're the greatest of all time or anything, but somebody throws a touchdown pass, hey, it's a touchdown pass. And so I when I approached it was sort of try to come more from that analytical point of view, in large part because I didn't have the wit that Jesse had, and I couldn't remember jokes like they were nearly as funny as Bobby was. But yeah, to me, they're 1 and 2 for sure.
Not that you asked for my opinion, but I'd switch him. I'd say Jesse number 1 because he was big time. When Jesse was on commentary, that was big time, and when Bobby was on commentary, it never felt quite as big time. So
really,
yeah. Well, I think it's just because Jesse did the first 6 WrestleManias in a row, and when he's on but also he's got the more commanding voice. He's a little less comedic. I thought his chemistry was bob on with Vince McMahon, especially, and Gorilla Monsoon. And there was. It's funny actually because I'd written this down as well. This does pertain to this clash. Is that both Jesse and Jim Ross have both admitted that it was Jim Ross's fault why their chemistry was not as good as Jesse's with the other two. Because I think Jesse's way of saying it was, well, Jim wouldn't sell my stuff. I'd throw out a really obvious line and Jim wouldn't bite on it. And I just don't think those two got on personally that well anyway. And I think even Jim's held his hand up and said, I could have been more receptive.
Yeah, I mean, professional to say Jesse could be a bit grating. Believe it or not, we would have some. I was telling Moose last night we'd have some in the dressing room, some real heated political discussions, and it would always end with him go, "Well, you know what you're talking about," and he'd walk out, right? Just cut it off, So, but yeah, it's again, me putting Bobby at number 1 is only because I think, again, in that sports entertainment system, and what they would take wrestling to, Bobby so fit into that. And the last time I saw Bobby, one of the last times, he'd had the surgery, no jaw, and we're at WrestleCade, and I see his wife pushing him in his wheelchair. So I gave my bag to Boo. So I run, give me that. I'm pushing down. So we get there, and she calls inside to the vendor. The vendor comes out and meets. So we go inside, and we get on the elevator, and the vendor looks at the thing. He's going, and Bobby says something, and I'm please understand, I am not making fun, but this is what it sounded like with no jaw. And his wife goes, starts laughing. She smacks him on the shoulder. What did he say? She goes, he said, that's the first time I've ever seen somebody get lost in an elevator. And, it was so typically Bobby Heenan, just so perfect for that second. That I thought he does this 24 hours a day. This isn't just when he's on camera. But Jesse, having been that big star in wrestling, certainly brought some of that panache with him too. You'll probably ask 10 other people and get, 5 that say Bobby, 5 that say Jesse, 6, 4, whatever. But it's going to be in the eye of the beholder. But suffice it to say, both of them were phenomenal at it.
First match, Cactus Jack versus the prettiest man in WCW, Johnny B. Bad. Highlights how hit and... Do you know, actually, I thought this first match, for what it's worth, highlights how hit and miss the WCW theme music was. I thought Cactus Jack's was bloody awful. Mr. Bang Bang. I listened to it afterwards. Whereas Johnny B. Bad's was great. Absolutely fit the character, but it almost seemed like almost the same song, just like rejigged slightly. Bad blaster into the crowd. Match kicks off, a quick affair, perfectly fine. Although there's one bit before the finish where Bad whips Cactus into the ropes. It looked jarring to me because he doesn't do it in the middle of the ropes. He does it almost near the corner, and that leads to the finish where Johnny does a dive off to do a sunset flip. He misses. Dive off the top ropes to miss the sunset flip. Misses. Cactus Jack does an elbow and pins him. And I thought, that's a Bill Watts finish if I ever saw one.
Oh yeah. There's something that I want to point out of this. Sorry, but this is the way I watch matches. I've known Mick since well before this, and the way he's carrying himself, you can see the foundations of what would become Mankind and Dude Love and the other characters. You can see that in there. But I'm going to point specifically to his movement in the ring. This is something that trained eyes in wrestling do. When you watch him moving in the ring, I want you to pay close attention to his feet. As whether he's hitting a move or he's taking a move or it's a misdirection, it's very much this. Not this. Uncertain feet. Dominic used to call it stamping out ants. And I pointed out to Moose last night. I said, look, that is Dominic's training. Now watch my feet later, and you can see Dominic DeNucci in the ring and what he had taught to Mick and I. Mick is very unorthodox, and he's working with a guy that's a polished guy, right? A charismatic character, and somehow he made it mesh. And that's not an easy thing to do at times. Like I said, I think Johnny was a bit too early. The business hadn't yet gotten to that over the top place that it would be going. But Mick, in his positioning and in his movements, even when he's doing the awkward stuff, like his kick being left-handed, his kicks are look sort of backward or disorderly to me because he's reversed. But I watch his positioning and a lot of that stuff, but it's in and out of the corners and switching places. Again, watch Mick's feet. It's not a tap dance into the corner. It's a boom, boom, boom. Very much like a basketball player putting it in the plant foot and taking the shot. And in that, you can see that even in that whole crazy list of characters that Mick Foley played, on the foundational point of it, Dominic had imbued himself and even a character as crazy as Cactus Jack. Right. So it was interesting to watch, because it's been so long since I've seen those matches. And this is like not long after us in Dominic's school. And but both of them working on, and you're right, the finish bled out. Bill Watts' finish, right? And you could also see how they were curtailed on time. So like a lot of the stuff that you would expect to see in a match between two guys like that was not in that match because it's a curtain jerk where to get in there and get out of there. And in the business's mindset, this is where we're going to check out the camera angles, make sure the lighting's good, the cameras and the sound is good. They go in there, bap, 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 something simple, move, cover 1, 2, 3, in and out. Curtain jerk, the classic curtain jerk.
As you said, it was a very, very quick in and out match. 2 minutes 50 seconds. Cactus Jack wins via pinfall. Then the next thing is, now I know you said you were watching the matches. You may have skipped through here and there. Did you watch the Too Cold Scorpio vignette?
Yes. Yeah.
Huh.
And I said, I can't wait till the next time I see Charlie and Scotty, because I want to see how much that they take ownership of. Does that embarrass them like Dean Douglas does me, or Dynamic Dudes does me? But I like the charisma that Charlie was showing in that. And again, we're looking at this from 2023 back, but at this time, this is like one of the things that we in wrestling were trying to imbue the kids. Hey, school's important, and sometimes that sounds a little bit corny coming from like a franchise type character saying that. Would be like, come on, get out of here. So I like the message that was in it, but when I look back at this kind of stuff, there's a time, there's the instances when I watch it and I think, boy, this looks very dated to this moment in time. And look, rap music is making its rise now. It's still on its trajectory upward. And right in the same time frame, we have Can't Touch This, da, 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 and the dancing guy and everything. And then Charlie's got great rhythm, right? But I'm watching his match. He does a lot of these off the top rope things onto Scotty. And I want to point this out because I say it all the time, and I know it sounds like I'm making this up. He floats. He doesn't come. He's not up and down. He jumps in the air, and there's just sort of like he comes down.
It's like hang time, isn't there?
Yes.
You must be the only heavyweight who has that.
Yeah. Trust me, gravity grabbed my ass when I jump off that top rope, and I watch him, and it's like I always joke, "Are you got bird bones or something?" Like, because he get up and just like, oh, dude, okay, he's coming out. Hold on, he'll be here. There he is. Boom, right, and he comes down on you. Amazing. I to this day I don't know how he does it.
Just with the vignette as well, I want to harp on it because it really made me laugh. I actually first saw this on the WrestleCrap website. Because it's just so bananas. Because I think it's like some kids at the basketball court, they don't want to go to school. Then Too Cold Scorpio turns up in a limo and tells them to go to school. And he says, "Tell you what, I'll take you there." What, in the limo? No. Are we going to walk? No. And then I think he sort of intimates that he's going to dance them to school. And then he starts doing a little. Then he starts doing a little dance. But yeah.
Well, when he first would take you to school, I'm thinking like, dude, like, don't put him in that car because bad things. Like today, looking back, you're like, no, don't do that. Just it's funny again how this stuff like so dates to that time, like, and you can see it. But again, for me, like, look at what he's doing and look at in context of the time frame he's doing it. Each time he does like a jump in the air and spin and leg drop, or the 1.5, or just these things he's doing that really the most ardent wrestling fans had probably seen some of that in Japan with the smaller guys like a Mysterio, or some of the luchadors in Mexico, and some of the Japanese wrestlers, Liger and things. But you hadn't seen a 230, 240 pound guy doing those types of things. And I think Charlie really opened the door to that, that, hey, these guys can do other stuff than just, lock up headlocks and bear hugs and things, way before his time.
Scorpio wins clean with the 450 in 4:30. We'll talk about Raven another time. There's going to be plenty of opportunities for Raven to come up. We'll stick with Scorpio just very briefly. Who invented the 450? Was it Scorpio? Was it Scott Steiner, as far as you know?
Oh, good. You got me. Watching each of them doing it, I was, just flummoxed. The guys like my size were able to do those kind of moves, that they, again, this is this transition period of wrestling where we're seeing like all this new stuff being tried, and some of it's working, some of it's not working, but you can see like where it's opening doors. How many people, since when we look at what we call spot monkey wrestling today, I think you can point a lot of that back. Not blaming, but you can see where clearly these kids paid attention to like what Sabu was doing and what Scorpio was doing, and imbuing that into their own work, much like I was trying to imbue Bruno and guys like that into my work. It's I've always said with Charlie, he's one of those guys that for whatever reason, we talk about so many guys like this, but just so underutilized because how deft he was in the ring.
Now we have a history package on the Thunder Cage setup, and then Harley Race. This is on a show beforehand. Harley Race trying to find people for his team to enter the Thunder Cage match. I have written here, someone shoot Michael Hayes. He's the worst interviewer. I think it's just because he kept just like speaking every two. Cactus Jack. Like just repeating everything Harley said. Anyway, that's my thing.
Yeah.
Paul Orndorff Cactus Jack match on WCW main events where Cactus doesn't appreciate Harley throwing him back in the ring, and he attacks Harley, prompting Vader to come out and triple team Cactus along with Harley and Paul Orndorff. Orndorff would soon finish up with Smoky Mountain Wrestling and join WCW full-time, once again filling in for Rick Rude. And then, as we saw later on in that package to set up this Thunder Cage match, Cactus then comes out later with a shovel and beats up all three men. Of the three people that Cactus hits, did you notice who he hit very hard?
It looked like on the shots himself, like Vader was taking the stiffer shots. I could see him being really careful with Harley. But I thought all the shots, again, hindsight looking back, for the things that we would see Mick do later with chair shots, both giving and taking, I thought that the shovel looked, to what we'd see later, really lame comparatively. But again, this is the front end. They hadn't seen a lot of that kind of stuff previous.
Now, I'm going to save this for a bit later, but there is a little mystery here as to why Cactus Jack was turned babyface. But we'll explore that later on. In the rest of this show, we've got, I don't know, a few minutes left. The next bit is the Slam Jam 1 advert with a song that I've written here, Low Key Slaps. It was actually a really good bit of hip-hop, decent hip-hop. Don't Step to Ron Simmons' theme. That's the first track off the Slam Jam #1 WCW album, and this annoyed WWF because they had intended on calling their album Slam and Jam, or one way or the other. Yeah, but somehow WCW beat them to the punch on that one. Anyway, next one, and we'll probably end on this actually. Chris Benoit with the Zebra Stripes versus Brad Armstrong. A low-key dream match between two of the finest technical wrestlers of any generation.
Yeah. When we were going through it, Chris had gone a little bit past the beginning of the match, and in a second or two, I see the German suplex. I know it's Brad. I can see his boots BA, but I know that the tights that it was in my brain. I knew who wore those tights, but because you couldn't see who it was, I was who's doing that? And I'm waiting. And then he gets up and you see the hair, and almost simultaneously, Jim Ross or somebody says, Chris Benoit over Brad Armstrong. And I thought, that's right, Chris wore those tights. And, you go back and watch that German suplex at the end. It is flawlessly executed. And, to me, that is, again, like what you saw coming out of Stu's school, what you saw coming out of the dojos in Japan. The promotions in Mexico, when they would hit those particular moves, especially finish moves, there was no leeway to do it half-assed or sort of right. And to me, like, you could see in Benoit's execution of that, him understanding how important that, you can screw anything else up in the match, that has to be perfect. And I'm not saying he screwed anything else up in the match, but like that was like, oop, boom, exclamation point. And Brad taking it, right? And you see Brad making a competitive match the whole way through. I think Brad's one of those guys. I think the fans that know me out there know how much I looked up to and respected Brad. I were good friends that lived together, traveled together, but he was really excellent in the ring. And when you go back and watch him, he's again like one of those unsung heroes that you scratch your head and think like, okay, why? And in Brad's case, I think a big part of it was the character that you would see on TV was the character that he would portray. Because of what he had grown up watching. He watched his dad, Bob Arm for the Bullet. I'm going to go out there and give 100%. I'm going to burn off. Okay, I believe that sounds great. Brad would get on. The funny thing was, we've all seen now in hindsight, Brian James, how animated and the dancing and the beatboxing and the rapping and stuff. Brad was, love you, Brian, but I think Brad was even more talented. In the dressing room, Brad could tell jokes, be moonwalking, beatbox, make up a rap right there on the spot. Blah, blah, blah. But then he go in front of that camera. I'm like, 100%. I'm like, oh, let that guy in the dressing room out. My God, that guy's a star. And he just could not do it. Like Brian was the one to figure it out. Like I can go out there and be a little over the top and be so much more entertaining. But that said, when you watch Brad in the ring, I would argue to you, find something that doesn't look legit with him when you're watching. It's just like golf clap. It's like that ain't easy for me. I'm a stickler on stuff like that. But boy, when I watch him back, and it doesn't matter if he's going over, putting somebody over, he goes out there and delivers the goods every time. You'd be hard pressed to really point something out that Brad fucks up in the ring. Chris he's young here. He's coming in there and getting a win over a vet like that is a big deal. But he didn't shirk from it either. Like you could see him taking it completely serious. And the way he's executing his moves, that when I think of Chris Benoit, that's what I see. Like that, it wasn't just to grab you by the wrist and throw you the ropes and then like you run 96 feet and come back. He looked like he could throw a tow truck like that. He both legs bending down, grab him by both hands around the wrist. They're shoving the guy as he goes by. Each of those little things, that any one of those things by themselves, almost meaningless. Put them together collectively. And watch Chris Benoit do an Irish whip. Watch Chris Benoit do a flying headbutt. Watch him do a German suplex. And it's bam, 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 bam. It's post to post.
I'm so glad you mentioned Irish whip. I just wrote down Irish whip. And the reason I saw it is Rip Rogers wonderfully describes it as seen on TV wrestling. So if you think you're mimicking something, you Irish whip somebody, just grab them by an arm, tug them, and then they'll do all the rest of the work. What these two were doing when they did the Irish whip, grab one hand on the back with the other, throw them, and then follow with them into the ropes. Yes. And then when they bounce back, they've got one step before they're hit. So you can actually, that's something that you can buy. And I really enjoy people who can do an Irish whip properly.
Yeah. We all get lazy, right? I mean, it's why we're all, I think, our worst critic. Any of us watch our matches back and say, I see everything I'm doing wrong. We all, those of us that are being serious with ourselves, we catch everything we're doing wrong because we don't want to do the wrong things. But when you watch guys like Brad and guys like Benoit, like I said, go back and watch that, freeze frame it and watch it frame to frame. I still dare you to find something that doesn't look legit, that doesn't come off as believable. Again, those two guys are like the poster childs for the kayfabe of our business, the protecting of our business, making it look like what it's supposed to look like. And you see the thing like in the Lucha Libre, right? They'll tap you on the shoulder, you run 20 feet that way, and then 20 feet back, and I clothesline you. Well, you look like a dumbass, right? But like you're describing, and right as you're coming off those ropes, boom, there's the clothesline taking your head off. One looks legit, and one looks like sports entertainment to me.
Yeah. That was a World of Sport Irish whip, because that's how they do it there. Obviously, the rings are smaller, but you whipped them in. I mean, before basically let's say I'm the person giving the whip, before my hand lets go of their arm, they're already in the ropes. And they've got one step out before they get hit. So there's none of this sort of like, just obviously running by yourself. Let me just go through a couple of things with the match. The crowd did not care at all to start off with, but they would do later on. Little things just like how deep Benoit throws a kick to the gut lets you know that shit's on. Because it's just like... And it didn't look like he'd killed him, but it looked serious because his knees even brought back with the force of Brad coming towards him. What else? The first move the crowd actually reacts to is Benoit hanging Brad out to dry on the top rope with a suplex, sort of like that... what do you call it? Not like a stun gun, but sort of like that with the belly. And then followed by a springboard clothesline onto the floor. The crowd just went mental. And I thought, God, what a few years makes in the business, because then Jericho would do that in every single match he was ever in. Yeah. But at the time, that was like a hugely different thing. And then Benoit misses an incredibly tight diving headbutt. Brad briefly takes over before Benoit counters it into a bridging full Nelson suplex for the pin. Absolutely flawlessly executed that last move.
Yes, sir.
Pretty much all of them.
Earns the golf clap. I mean, that's that for again, the kids out there, watch that back and emulate that. If there's something you want to emulate, that's the kind of stuff to emulate, because it's I for whoever's in that building, nobody's walking away going, fake wrestling shit. They're walking away going, those guys. In other words, they're turning themselves into being marks on performances like that.
Just to end on, you were saying about Brad Armstrong could never get his personality behind the scenes in front of the camera and make money off that. When Vince Russo would go to WCW in 1999, he repackaged Brad Armstrong into, do you remember the character's name?
No.
Buzzkill.
Buzzkill, yes.
And he was told to imitate your more popular brother Brian as closely as humanly possible. Do you remember the Buzzkill days?
I don't remember specifically. I if I'm not mistaken, he sort of you can see Brad in his wrestling stuff while he's playing that character. Looks like Brad Armstrong, but the stuff in between looked contrived because it just wasn't. He had grown up watching that style of wrestling where the baby faces were going to give 100% and all that kind of thing. And for whatever reason, he couldn't break that. If you want to see Brad looking, at least in my estimation, looking like something that is a work, it was him trying to portray this character, because it was a quantum leap from him. That was pretty much the guy he would play in the dressing room, but convincingly back there, because there's no cameras and he's just hanging out with the guys out in front. It always reminded me of the I don't know if it'll make reference to you guys in England, the old Looney Tunes cartoons.
Yeah, of course,
right?
Yeah.
And they had the remember the guy, construction worker, finds the box under the time, like a time capsule. There's a frog. Hello, my baby. Hello, my darling. He comes out dancing and singing and walking the tightrope, and then he gets in front of the camera, and the frog goes, ribbit. Right. That was Brad. Brad was the hello, my baby guy in the dressing room, and in front of a camera, ribbit.
Michigan J Frog. I even know the name.
Boom. That's it. I would have never, $1,000,000 I couldn't have given that name, but that's it. Michigan J Frog. Yes, sir.
There you go. I'll tell you what.
Tightrope walking, got the umbrella in his hand, top hat.
He was one of my favourite characters, and he was rarely in the cartoons as well. Anyway, we'll get on Warner Brothers, I'm sure, for another time. But for now, thank you very much for watching, everybody. We still don't have any plugs. Next week will be the fan question episode, and next week I'm going to tell you how to contact us for the subsequent, the month after's fan question episode. But for now, Shane takes out the show.
Hey, you've been paying attention again in Franchises University? Class dismissed.